all those moments will be lost in time.
Hey guys, what's up and welcome back to my channel. Today we're gonna read some stories from r/Let's Not Meet. If you don't know what that is, it's a subreddit where people post creepy stories that are supposedly true. Before we read those stories, I wanted to thank today's sponsor, which is Shudder. Shudder is a premium streaming service from AMC Networks. Shudder has the largest and fastest growing human curated selection of thrilling and dangerous entertainment. You can stream great thrillers, horror, and suspense for $5.99 a month or $56.99 a year, and on all of your favorite devices such as Amazon Fire TV, Roku, Xbox One, iOS, and Android. Shudder has a unique collection of exclusive and original films and series, horror classics, and blockbuster hits such as Creepshow, the new TV series based on the famous films by George Romero. To try Shudder for free for 30 days, go to shudder.com and use promo code ReadyToGlare. One film in particular that I enjoy from Shudder is Train to Busan. I'm not going to ruin the plot for you, but essentially it's like a virus/zombie film that is extremely suspenseful to the point where I was stressed watching it, but in the positive way. So I highly encourage checking that out if you're interested. I will also be leaving other titles that I like from Shudder in the description box down below. Thank you again to Shudder for sponsoring this video, and remember to try Shudder for free for 30 days, go to shudder.com and use promo code ReadyToGlare. Anyway, let's get into these creepy stories. All of them will be linked in order in the description box. Up until junior year of high school, I flew mostly under the social radar and stuck to my status as a nerd girl. But when I was 15, I joined varsity cheer. My school's cheerleaders weren't popular by definition, but everyone kind of knew who we were because we were on the announcements, performed at pep rallies, and generally engaged with the students a lot. I made a lot of friends that year, and some of them happened to be the quote-unquote cool kids. For a while, I thought this was my long-awaited karma payoff for the years of bullying I'd suffered at their hands. I even developed a crush on one of them. A crush which the junior cheer captain herself volunteered to help me pursue. Homecoming is a big deal where I'm from, and I began to fantasize about my crush asking me to go with him. I'd heard rumors he was planning a dramatic proposal, and as homecoming season approached, I became more and more sure I would be his date. The junior cheer captain, who was close with him, kept dropping hints that I was right. One day at practice, she asked me what my favorite candy was, and I knew it would be so my crush would know what to give me. You can imagine my surprise when, after an exhausting theater rehearsal, I walked into the parking lot and was confronted by a guy I'd hardly spoken to asking me to be his date. My theater friends all applauded, assuming I was overjoyed. I saw both my parents in the parking lot recording the whole surprise. But most importantly, the cool kids I'd recently befriended were standing right there behind him, egging him on. I didn't understand why, because he wasn't popular at all. In fact, he's known to be kind of creepy. The junior cheer captain was laughing, encouraging him to give me the box of my favorite candy he was holding. She definitely orchestrated the whole thing. I didn't really know the guy, but I didn't want to humiliate him in front of the coolest kids in school, so I faked a smile and rolled with it. I promised myself I'd deny him later, in private, so he wouldn't be embarrassed. Afterwards, when my parents excitedly asked me how I felt about the ordeal, I explained how uncomfortable it made me. I said I got strong creepy vibes from the guy. That didn't fly with my parents. My mother accused me of having expectations too high, and my father demanded to know, not for the first time, if I was secretly a lesbian. I had never had a boyfriend or shown much interest in dating. To make his case stronger, I just become best friends with the only openly gay girl our school had ever seen. Long story short, I knew that if I shut down my date, I'd effectively declare war on my parents. However, I played my dad's protective instinct against him and persuaded him to let me friend zone my date. After all, he knows how high school boys think, right? I texted my date that night and explained that I only saw us as friends but would still be happy to go to homecoming with him. He was very polite about it, though I could tell he was interested in me romantically. It seemed we'd reach a deal until the next day at school when one of my cheerleader friends referred to my date as my boyfriend. I corrected her and told her we're just going to homecoming as friends. She seemed confused and told me my date was telling anyone who could listen that I was his girlfriend. A few more of my friends approached me with similar comments, and I confronted my date about them. He denied all involvement and suggested it was just a rumor. I reminded him that we were just friends and had zero romantic interest in him. He said he understood. I got a call from the junior cheer captain. She pretended to be sweet and conspiratorial, but I was still annoyed that she'd led me to believe my crush would ask me to homecoming. She began her attempt to persuade me that I was wrong to friendzone my date. She said that she'd spent many afternoons planning his proposal with him, and she knew he was kind of creepy from afar, but he was sweet and caring underneath all that. I said if he was such a catch, she should date him. Annoyed, she dropped the sweet act, she told me I had to date him because he liked me so much and he'd gone to so much trouble to ask me in homecoming. I had to give him a chance because he'd gone out on a limb for me. I told her she was wrong and I didn't have to do anything I didn't want to do, and I owed him nothing. I ended up hanging up on her soon after that, but that was just the beginning. Starting the next Monday, he would corner me in the hallway and give me a rose he held in his teeth. He usually did so between my 6th and 7th periods when my path through the hall crossed his. I was deeply uncomfortable with this and told him so, but he wouldn't stop. I took different routes to escape him, but the junior cheer captain and her posse made a point of tracking me down so he could find me elsewhere. Every time he did this, everyone in the area would treat it as a sweet romantic gesture despite my obvious discomfort. Wouldn't any girl be lucky to have a boy so devoted to her that he gave her a rose every day? He was still telling everyone I was his girlfriend. The final straw, for me, was when he walked into a class he wasn't in to find me and give me my daily rose. My teacher, who was friends with the junior cheer captain, let this happen. For weeks afterwards, she would ask me about my date every day. When he came in, I told him to get out and leave me alone. His feelings were clearly hurt and he left looking like a kicked puppy. My classmates started calling me a cold, hard bitch. It didn't matter what I had to say about him. I was an ice queen, refusing the sweet boy's advances. Everyone in the school had decided that I was in love with him, and nobody cared what I had to say about it. My crush, who was a part of the popular group, joined the junior cheer captain in pressuring me into returning my date's feelings. At every event where the cheerleaders were present, my date would push his way to the front of the crowd. He would go to great lengths to get my attention. At football games, he would wave a flag in the student section so I'd look at him when we were cheering. The other girls would make comments on how endearing he was when he waited in the parking lot by our bus back to the school just to hug me and tell me how great I did. I didn't know what else to do other than let this happen. I had only recently ascended to a position of visibility. If I conflicted too hard with the cool kids who were so dead set on setting me up with this guy, I could be an outsider all over again. I hoped that if I just kept ranting to my real friends about how creepy he was and publicly let him do what he wanted, it would all blow over. My school had a 15-second attention span, so some scandal had to one-up me sooner or later. The truth emerged as usual in the locker room. It turns out the junior cheer captain had been telling him during their afternoons together that I was into him. He'd come to her for help announcing his crush on me, and she'd gone a step further and convinced him I felt the same, despite the fact that I didn't even know his name. She'd lied to him for weeks prior to the homecoming proposal, and when I told her that was wrong, she didn't care. She told me I should be grateful because everybody was starting to think I was gay. My best friend, the lesbian who was starting a gay revolution, and I, inspired, spread a rumor that we were dating. After all, everyone already thought I was gay, right? But my date wasn't fazed. In fact, he told everyone that he'd just turned me straight again. Ew. 3 weeks after he asked me, it was finally homecoming night. Thanks to cheer obligations and a complete coincidence involving a switched backpack that left me without my dress, I ended up only attending the dance for half an hour. My date awkwardly stood on the side of the room while I danced my heart out to Mr. Brightside. I almost felt bad for him when, right at the end, the junior cheer captain appeared like a summoned demon to suggest we slow dance at the next opportunity. Thank God I escaped that one by walking to the DJ and suggesting he play Footloose. My date walked me out to the parking lot to wait for my mom to pick me up. While we waited for her to drive around, which took entirely too long because she still hoped I'd stop making a fuss and date him, he asked me out. I politely declined. He quickly stammered that we could go with a group of people like the junior cheer captain and my crush. I denied him again and made it clear we were only friends and I wasn't interested in romantic endeavors because I was too busy. That was actually true. I was in all advanced classes, varsity theater, and cheer, and worked part-time. A few days later, a teacher eloped to Vegas and nobody cared about my love life anymore. My date and I were distanced again by classes and activities and work. It appeared that everything was going back to normal. That Friday at the football game, my crush asked me to sit on his shoulders for the alma mater, kind of a romantic thing at my school. Overjoyed, I accepted, and I hoped this would be the beginning of a new chapter for me. I ignored the frantically waving flag in the stands. Monday, my date stood on a chair in his second period class and announced that everyone should be wary of my crush because he would, quote-unquote, steal your girl. I heard everyone buzzing about it a few hours later when someone called me a bitch, again, for breaking my date's heart. I knew I was being dramatic, but I decided not to go to lunch that day, terrified of running into him. I'm so glad I didn't. Later, I saw on Snapchat that my date had carved my name into his arm with a pair of scissors. His bleeding arm was screenshotted and sent to me by half a dozen people, most of them demanding why I'd hurt him like this. He did it in the middle of lunch in a crowded cafeteria, and somehow no administration noticed or cared. The school was buzzing. My date was a broken-hearted victim, and I was the evil, secretly gay bitch who wouldn't give him a chance. I got so many dirty looks. By 5th period, I was ready to just walk out, but my good girl instincts kicked in and I decided to tough it out for 2 more hours. Around that time, I got a panic text from one of my cheer friends. While she'd initially been insistent that I date the creepy guy, she'd apparently changed her mind after the lunch incident earlier. She told me that my date, who was in her 5th period class, was going off the rails. He'd started out saying that he wanted to kill himself because I wouldn't love him. This had escalated to saying he'd kill my crush for lying to me and stealing me away. Finally, he'd started talking about how he knew where I lived. My parents had given him my address when he initially wanted to ask me to the dance at my house, and he would make me pay for wronging him. I knew that, after 6th period, our paths in the hall would cross. Since the beginning of this ordeal, the school had cracked down on students getting outside, and my alternate route to escape him was no longer an option. My class was at the far end of the hall with nowhere to go but into the central hub, and he would be coming from the other end of the hall towards mine. I was stuck up a chimney, basically. Desperate, I texted the junior cheer captain to finish what she started and tell him that I was not and had never been interested in him. She made this mess and I would make sure she had to clean it up. She said she'd go to the counselor, but she didn't know what else to do. This was way beyond her control now. For the first and only time, I skipped class. I hid out in the theater hall and waited for 7th period. I got a few texts during the passing period that my date was waiting for the bathrooms. There was a little alcove right there where you can't see people coming around the corner, and the thought of him hiding there and waiting for me to walk by alone horrified me. Right before 7th period began, a few of my classmates burst in, cackling, and proclaimed that my date was coming down here after school to kill my crush. They thought this was hilarious, but judging by the look on my crush's face, this wasn't a joke to him anymore. Our teacher brushed this off as typical theater drama, pun fully intended. I watched the clock and tried not to cry, knowing that by the time the bell rang, my date would be outside waiting for me and my crush to emerge. That day ended up being a work day, so my crush and I were able to escape the classroom and hide out elsewhere in the theater hall to get away from him. He opted for the black box theater and I went for the lighting closet. Obviously, I didn't witness what happened, but my best friend filmed me in afterwards. Allegedly, my date had turned up 3 minutes before the bell rang and stood outside the classroom where we couldn't see him when we opened the door. He told everyone standing around that he was ready to have a knife fight with my crush. We don't know if he actually had a knife or not, but the idea that he might was enough to terrify me. His arm was wrapped in paper towels that he was bleeding through. My best friend told him my crush and I were gone, but he didn't believe her. He stood outside for 25 minutes until the administrators began walking through to make sure no one was in the school who shouldn't be. My date wasn't in theater, so he wasn't allowed to stick around. That night, I texted him that not only would I never date him, but could no longer see even a friendship between us. I sent him a number to a suicide hotline and told him to get help. Finally, I told him that he needed to learn what no meant and I never wanted to speak to him again. He responded that he was sorry and asked if there was anything he could do to fix this. I told him no. I don't think he learned the meaning of the word after all, because the same pattern repeated itself a month later on Valentine's Day, next year at homecoming, senior year Valentine's Day, and prom, but those are other stories. I've since graduated and gone off to college 100 miles away from him. My family back home moved from the address my parents gave him. Contrary to popular belief, I'm not gay. My crush, on the other hand, came out a few months later, and we were friends for the rest of high school. I'm working on handling romantic endeavors in a healthy way, but he got in my head. He was the first person to ever show interest in me. Ironically, the last I saw him was my first and only homecoming game after graduating, but this time I had true friends to defend me when he predictably tried to pull some weird stuff with me. The worst part looking back was somehow being at fault for everything. To this day, people from my high school reference the whole ordeal as that time you wouldn't date that poor shy kid. I can't even appreciate red roses anymore. So, homecoming date from hell, let's not meet again. That was wild. That was absolutely wild. And honestly, the story frustrates me because she never owed him jack shit. Like, she never owed him even the kindness of going to homecoming with him as a friend. She didn't owe him that. So it really angers me that people were brushing off her alarm comments as like, oh, you're being a bitch. Because if you have a weird vibe and you don't want to go out with someone, nobody should be pressuring you to do that. I despise the whole are you a lesbian thing because she didn't go out with anyone. So obviously there was nothing wrong with being a lesbian, though apparently this school seemed to think there was. And so did the parents, apparently, which in and of itself I could go on a rant about. But aside from that, I've always hated how people take nothing and turn it into something. You know, kind of like when you're silent and someone interprets your silence as you being a snob or you being a bitch, when in reality, maybe you're just shy. I feel like it's kind of the same thing for this girl who had never had a relationship. Just because she didn't have a relationship, that doesn't mean you should project what you think onto her and make that the reality. I'm gonna move on to another story before I start screaming. This happened to me when I was a child, and I still remember it very clearly to this day, as it set me up for a lifelong fear of being watched as I sleep. I was 6 years old, and me and my family were living in public housing as we'd recently come to America. Our apartment was on the first floor, but slightly underground, as my bedroom window was level with the ground outside. The windows were big and had a ledge. On my ledge, I had my stuffed animals lined up looking out the window. On this specific night, I was having trouble sleeping as there were strange noises coming from outside my window, along with tapping. I peeped out my window and saw a strange man crouching and peeping through the gap between my curtains and the wall, looking directly at me with a strange look on his face. I started screaming and crying, and my dad ran into the room to reassure me that everything was okay and that I was just having a bad dream. But I hadn't been sleeping. I couldn't sleep that night. I was having a weird feeling the entire night, as if I was being watched. My dad opened the curtains and nothing was there. To comfort me, he slept in my bed with me, but I couldn't sleep. He, on the other hand, knocked out. It was getting later in the night and the weird noises started again. It sounded like someone trying to cut through the screen and tapping on the window with a blade as he cut through with the motion. I woke up my dad quietly, trying to show him what I told him about. He ripped open the curtains and saw a man with a knife cutting through the screen. He jumped out of bed and ran for the door, and then ran to chase the man who was watching me sleep and trying to break into my room. He chased the man to his car, but he sped off before my dad had a chance to confront the man. My parents called the police and told them what happened, but nothing ever really came of it. From that night on, I've had an irrational fear and never sleep by a window. I used to have night terrors about the incident for years. I haven't thought about this in a while now, but I had another dream about it recently and couldn't stop thinking about it. I asked my dad about it recently and he refused to talk to me about it. So, strange man trying to break into my room, let's not meet, and I hope I've never met you before. This story was a lot shorter than the previous one, but the reason I read it is because I think, in a sense, it's relatable in that this is a pretty common fear that I know of, which is one of the reasons why I don't sleep by my windows, and I'm quite paranoid about someone breaking through my windows at night. Let me know if you have this fear, but the whole idea of someone creeping up on you at a vulnerable time, like when you're sleeping or in bed, has always been deeply scary because obviously you're at their mercy essentially. It's not like in bed you're holding a knife ready to stab an intruder, because who really expects an intruder to come in? Very creepy, and I'm really sorry for this person for having like all that trauma after too. So I hope they're doing okay. This happened quite a few years ago. I was a 21-year-old female college student studying abroad at a university in the Kansai region of Japan. I'd lived a fairly sheltered suburb life up until that point, so this experience really stood out to me at that time. I also grew up in a fairly religious household, although my parents were never strict about it and are what I would call socially liberal Catholics, pro-choice, pro-gay rights. I had friends who had gone to the university previously, and they introduced me to a nice Japanese woman aged around 45-50. I'll call her Kotoko, not her real name. It turned out that every year Kotoko hired an American from my program to help her with her English. Her husband worked, but she didn't, and they never had kids, so she spent her time studying, cooking, and reading. With my friend's introduction, she had a friend who had worked for Kotoko the previous year. I agreed to become her next tutor. Kotoko and her husband were really great. I'd go to their house every Wednesday afternoon, and we'd spend 2 hours on English, and at the end, 30 to 60 minutes on Japanese. Kotoko knew I was slated to take the Japanese fluency test at the end of my time in Japan and insisted on helping me, even though she was paying me around $50 a week to help her. We grew close during this time, and I went to a wine tasting with her and her husband, and when my mom visited, Kotoko hosted a dinner for us. For around 7 months, Kotoko and I had a great relationship. It bears noting that she never mentioned religion during this time. One week we decided we would do a Saturday morning session, and then we'd get lunch together. Friday night, I received an email from Kotoko. Although she had my email from the beginning, we had only ever texted, and very rarely, so it was very strange to get an email. Also, the email came at 3:30 in the morning, so I didn't see it until Saturday, about 2 hours before I was scheduled to arrive at her apartment. The email said, paraphrasing, it's been a decade, "Are we still on for today, or are you still mad at me?" Absolutely confused, I responded, "Of course we are, and I'm not mad. I'll be there in 2 hours." We had never had a fight, nor any harsh words. Less than an hour later, I got another email from Kotoko. The email described how she and I had had a huge fight the night before, and that she would forgive me and was relieved I wasn't still angry. Since we hadn't spoken in almost a week, I was pretty thrown, but I knew Kotoko and figured I would just speak to her about it when I got there. I got to the apartment and Kotoko's husband was there. He was never there on Wednesdays. I found this comforting because I knew him well, so if Kotoko kept acting strange, I was sure he'd notice and explain. I sat down with Kotoko to begin our lesson. Kotoko's English was pretty good, but this day she had a really hard time producing English. From the beginning, I could see her frustration trying to speak, as if she couldn't pour her passion into the words properly. She quickly switched to Japanese and started a fast, anxious conversation about our quote-unquote fight. No matter what I said, I couldn't convince her we hadn't fought. In fact, denying it made her even more anxious, and she began telling me that I just didn't remember the fight because I wasn't enlightened and others were convincing me I didn't remember. The lesson never happened. Kotoko got more and more agitated. She told me my friends, a few of whom she had met, so she named them by name, were evil and bad and dragging me down to hell. She told me I was sinning for drinking and clubbing with my friends each week. She was so intense and certain, I began to develop a real fear of what I didn't know. I kept throwing glances to the study where I had seen her husband, assuming he would hear her rant and come out to calm her down. He never did. Finally, since we weren't studying, I suggested we go to lunch. I wanted to be in a public space. Outside her apartment building, Kotoko grabbed my arm so hard I thought it would bruise. She was a tiny person, so it was shocking. Looked directly in my eyes and said, "Your friend, name, is going straight to hell, but I can save her." Lunch was awful. By this point, I'd been listening to Kotoko for 2 hours and the constant ranting was getting to me. She told me how my parents and best friend were lost, but that she could save me. When I just stared at her in horror, she revised it so she could save me and one other and pressed me to pick the person I loved the most. Mom, dad, brother, or best friend, so she could save them from hell/the darkness. She went to the bathroom and I started frantically texting my friend Kevin to come to the local station because I was terrified. When she got out of the bathroom, she looked at me directly and said, "I know you're texting Kevin. He can't save you, only I can." She couldn't possibly have seen my phone from where she was standing. Finally, unable to take it anymore, I blurted out that I couldn't choose someone to save, so I didn't deserve to be saved either, and literally ran out of the restaurant. At this point, she had convinced me that my parents and best friend had died or were in danger, and I ran to the station where I called my parents long distance. When my mom answered at 3 a.m. her time, I burst into tears. I was so relieved she wasn't dead. When Kevin arrived, it took him 2 hours to calm me down and make me realize I hadn't met a disturbing prophet, but that Kotoko was likely mentally ill. I had never met someone who was experiencing a mental break, and her conviction had pulled me in until I truly couldn't figure out if she knew something about existence and the afterlife that I didn't. The fact that her husband acted perfectly normal and never indicated anything was going wrong is to this day one of the strangest things about it to me. A few days after this incident, Kotoko emailed me to confirm our Wednesday session. I was petrified and only responded I didn't think it would be good to continue, but I wished her well. She sent me many more emails and letters and even sent a few letters to my parents' house in the US. None of the letters mentioned religion or that day. I never responded again. I think this experience is one of the reasons I later became an atheist. I couldn't ever look at the ideas of heaven and hell in the same way again, and they were always tinged with real fear for me. Kotoko, I sincerely hope you got the help you needed and are doing better now, but let's never meet again. So stories around religion always freak me out a little bit, not because of religion, but because of stories like this, where someone has a mental break or has some kind of fixation that turns into some bigger issue. Now, we don't know if she has a mental illness or what was going on, if she genuinely believed that being sane. Always scares me when someone kind of takes religion into their own hands to the point where they think they see something you don't see. The whole manipulation of making you feel like you're lesser than, or that you can't keep living this way or else you're gonna go to hell. That kind of manipulation is nauseating, specifically because if you listen to someone ranting for so long and there's someone that you trust and know, I feel like it's kind of easy in the end to get sucked into it because their reality kind of turns into yours. So when they tell you that you're fucked, that your family doesn't love you or your family's going to hell and all that, you end up not necessarily believing them as much as you start doubting, well, do they love me? Like, did I do something wrong? And it pushes you into this whole thing of self-doubt, which can cause a whole shit show of problems for yourself, even if you're not necessarily that religious or even if you're atheist. Anyways, guys, thank you so much for watching. Thank you to my patrons as always, and let's get right into the fan art.